I was not looking for dwarves when I began this investigation. I was looking for doorways. Specifically, doorways in pre-industrial European cities that made no ergonomic sense. You have seen them too. In the narrow alleys of Prague, the administrative complexes of Vienna, and the subterranean levels of St. Petersburg. There are entrances so low an average man must crouch to enter, yet they are finished with the same royal stonework as the grand halls above them. Historians call these architectural quirks. They call them storage nooks or apprentice workshops. But they are lying to you. Look at the photographs from the mid-1800s. Not the circus advertisements, not the staged spectacles of Barnum. Look at the official state archives. You will see individuals of dramatically reduced stature, perfectly proportioned, standing in formal attire beside government officials. They are holding blueprints. They are wearing the medals of civil service. They are not curiosities. They are professionals. In a photograph from 1873, held in the French National Archives, a man barely 4 feet tall stands next to a municipal engineer in front of a half-finished bridge. They are both looking at the same structural plans. This was not a master and a pet. This was a collaboration of 2 different human scales. But then, something happened. A shadow fell over the world between 1890 and 1910. The photographs stopped. The blueprints were altered. The people who built the intricate clockwork of our world were suddenly and violently reclassified. They were no longer citizens. They were no longer engineers. They became medical anomalies. They became patients. What if I told you that the explosion of asylums and sanitariums at the end of the 19th century had nothing to do with mental health? What if these massive, fortress-like institutions were actually containment facilities for a population that no longer fit the New World Order? This was the Silent Purge. A genocide committed not with bullets, but with stethoscopes and census forms. They didn't just kill a people. They erased the very possibility of their existence. Before we dive into the dark records of the Victorian medical complex, we must look at the physical evidence they forgot to destroy. Throughout the Tartarian territories, the vast, unified civilization that preceded our fragmented nations, architecture was multi-scale. We talk often about the giants, the 15-foot doorways and the massive steps. But we ignore the other end of the spectrum. In the basement of the Winter Palace, there is a network of finished tunnels with ceiling heights of exactly 5 feet. They have ventilation, decorative moldings, and lighting fixtures. Official guides call them service ducts. Since when does a service duct require neoclassical aesthetics? In Budapest, during a 1920s renovation of a government complex, workers broke through a false wall and found an entire residential level built at a reduced scale. The Hungarian National Archives contain the work orders for that day. Did they call an archaeologist? Did they preserve this window into a lost society? No. The order was demolish and backfill. No survey, no photos, just systematic erasure. Why? Because by 1920, the narrative had already been set. There is only one human scale. Anything else is a fairy tale. But the tools tell a different story. In the storage vaults of the Smithsonian, there are 3 complete metalworking workshops recovered from Central Europe. The workbenches sit 18 inches off the ground. The hammers and crucibles are scaled down by 40%. Yet the wear patterns on the handles are consistent with decades of adult use. The scorch marks on the forge stones have been carbon dated to the 1600s. These weren't toys. These were the high-tech laboratories of their time. The people who used them had fine motor control and precision that we, with our clumsy, oversized fingers, can only dream of. They were the architects of the micro-world, the masters of the intricate machinery that powered the pre-industrial age. And then, the Great Standardization began. Around 1880, governments across the globe became obsessed with measurement. Anthropometry, the study of human proportions, became a weapon of state. Suddenly, normal was defined. A narrow window of height and weight was codified into law. If you were too tall, you were a giant with a glandular disorder. If you were too short, you were a medical dwarf. You were no longer a member of a different human branch. You were a malfunction. The census of 1890 in the Russian Empire was the first to include specific physical fitness markers for citizenship. If you did not meet the standard, you were not registered as a person. You were registered as a ward of the state. And where does the state put its wards? It puts them in the colonies. That is what they called the first asylums, farm colonies, and industrial retreats. Hidden away in the countryside, behind high walls, the multi-scale population of Tartaria was systematically segregated. Have you ever looked at the architecture of a 19th century asylum? They are massive. They are designed to hold thousands of people. The doors are huge, the corridors are wide enough to drive a carriage through, and the ceilings are cavernous. They tell us this was for light and air to cure the insane. But look closer. Look at the intake records. People were being committed for stature unsuitable for labor, hereditary physical deviation, and atavistic proportions. This wasn't a hospital. It was a holding pen. It was the final destination for the families who lived in those dual-scale neighborhoods of London and Paris. Between 1890 and 1900, entire districts were cleared under the guise of slum clearance. The buildings were structurally sound. Many were more sophisticated than the ones that replaced them. But they were unsuitable. They had those tiny passages. They had those multi-level living spaces. They were physical proof of a diverse humanity. So they were razed to the ground. The transition was so clinical, so quiet, that we mistook it for progress. We were told that the late 19th century was the dawn of modern medicine, the era when we finally began to care for the afflicted. But look at the admission logs of the great asylums built between 1870 and 1920. Look at the categories of the interned. You will find thousands of individuals labeled with unspecified physical degeneracy or atavistic stature. These were not people with broken minds. They were people with different bodies. In the London Municipal Archives, there is a housing survey from 1893 that describes a district in East London slated for immediate demolition. The surveyor notes, with a tone of clinical confusion, that the buildings featured two distinct scales of living spaces, integrated in ways that suggest intentional design rather than later modification. His recommendation was not to preserve this architectural marvel, but to raise it on grounds of unsuitable accommodation standards. By 1893, suitable had a new, rigid definition. Anything that deviated from the single-scale paradigm was a threat to the narrative of the standard man. But what happened to the people who lived in those integrated neighborhoods? They didn't just walk away. They were processed. The medical terminology created during this period is a masterclass in linguistic erasure. Exceptional height became gigantism, a pathology to be medicated. Proportional small stature became dwarfism, a disorder to be institutionalized. The very existence of a different human branch was pathologized out of the public record. Once you were labeled a medical case, you lost your right to own property, your right to marry, and your right to a history. I traced the genealogy of several families from the records of the Vienna administrative complex. In 1880, these families were listed as master craftsmen and technical administrators living in dual-scale housing. By 1895, the parents are dead or relocated to rural colonies, and the children simply vanish from the census. They don't appear in the death records. They don't appear in the marriage records. They were thinned out. The institutions they were sent to, places like the Broadmoor in England or the Salpêtrière in France, were vast cities of the forgotten. If you visit these sites today, the scale is still wrong. You will find patient wards with 15-foot ceilings and doorways that seem absurdly oversized for a standard hospital. Yet the staff passages are cramped and low. They were built as containment facilities for the two ends of the Tartarian spectrum, the giants and the small folk, both being removed from a world that was being forcibly shrunk to a single, manageable dimension. Consider the reproductive control. The eugenics movement, which reached its fever pitch in the early 20th century, wasn't just about race. It was about scale. The standard man was the ideal, a being of predictable size, predictable strength, and predictable needs. The small people of Tartaria, with their specialized skills and non-standard requirements, were a logistical nightmare for the emerging industrial empires. They required different tools, different furniture, different transportation. It was cheaper to eliminate the population than to maintain the infrastructure for their existence. So, the great social work began. Under the guise of public health, families were broken apart. Children who showed signs of non-standard growth were taken for specialized schooling. They were never seen again. Their descendants, if they were allowed to have any, were sterilized or absorbed into the general population through forced breeding programs designed to correct their stature. By 1930, the erasure was nearly complete. The little people were relegated to the realm of fairy tales, Santa's elves, and circus tropes. What makes this evidence so difficult to suppress completely is that the buildings are still standing. You can walk into a 19th century post office in a former Tartarian city and see the windows. There is the standard window, and then, often sealed with brick or hidden by a false ceiling, there is the smaller window, positioned at a height that makes sense only for someone 3.5 feet tall. Why would a government waste resources on 2 sets of windows for every floor? Unless there were 2 populations working in the same building, each according to their scale. This wasn't just in Europe. I found similar patterns in the British colonial records of India. The hill folk, described by early administrators, were not just a different tribe. They were described as a compact, perfectly formed race of engineers who maintained the complex irrigation systems of the mountains. By 1910, the British reports changed. The hill folk were suddenly described as suffering from endemic cretinism and physical stunting due to malnutrition. They were moved into sanitariums for their own protection. The irrigation systems, left without their master technicians, fell into ruin or were replaced by inferior British engineering. The pattern is global. The motive is control. A multi-scale society is a complex society. It is hard to tax, hard to police, and hard to standardize. The new masters of our world wanted a modular humanity. They wanted workers who could all use the same shovel, soldiers who could all wear the same uniform, and citizens who could all fit into the same 60-square-foot room. The silent purge was the ultimate act of corporate restructuring. They didn't just fire the employees who didn't fit. They deleted their entire species from the company's history. The final stage of the silent purge wasn't physical. It was psychological. Once the bodies were hidden in asylums and the architecture was bricked over, they had to deal with the memory. They had to make the next generation believe that a multi-scale world was a biological impossibility. This is where the modern education system and the medical-industrial complex joined forces. They created the normal curve. They taught us that any deviation from the average height was a genetic mistake, a mutation, or a deficiency. They took the survivors, those who had managed to avoid the asylums, and they turned them into spectacles. They were pushed into the circus, into the freak shows, where they were stripped of their dignity as engineers, architects, and administrators. They were forced to perform as midgets and dwarves for the amusement of the standard man. By making them objects of ridicule, the elites ensured that no one would ever take their history seriously again. If you saw a 3-foot-tall man in 1920, you didn't ask what bridge he had designed. You paid a nickel to watch him dance. But the stones do not lie. In the administrative archives of Vienna, I found a municipal planning document from 1887. It discussed the remodeling of a government building constructed in the 1770s. The language is clinical, almost boring, but buried in the technical specifications is a single line. Passages unsuitable for standard occupancy to be modified to contemporary requirements. Not demolished because they were broken, modified because they were unsuitable for the new standard. Contemporary to when? To 1887. The exact moment the great standardization was being forced upon the world. They were literally sanding down the edges of reality to fit a new, smaller box. This wasn't progress. It was an amputation. We lost the branch of humanity that possessed technical insights we can no longer grasp. Those fairy tale clockworks and impossible ancient machines were the products of hands that could move between gears, where our fingers would only crush the mechanism. What happened to their descendants? I believe they are still among us, their bloodlines thinned out, their history hidden in family legends of mountain folk or small ancestors. But most of them ended in those asylums. I traced the closing of one such facility in the 1950s. The records showed that even then, decades after the Purge began, there were elderly patients who had been there since childhood, listed with no family, no origin, and no diagnosis other than unusual stature. They lived and died in silence, the last witnesses to a civilization that treated them as equals. Look at your city again. Look at the buildings from the 1800s. Look for the half floors. Look for the windows that sit at your knee level. Look for the narrow, beautifully decorated doors that lead to nowhere because they've been sealed with concrete. Those weren't mistakes. Those were the homes of the architects of Tartaria. The silent purge worked because we wanted it to. It is easier to live in a world where everything is built for us, where we are the standard and everything else is a freak of nature. But that comfort comes at the price of the truth. We are living in the ruins of a much more complex, much more integrated world. A world where size didn't determine status, and where the little people were the giants of technology. They erased the people. They erased the records. But they couldn't erase the stone. The doorways are still there, measuring exactly 40 inches high, waiting for you to realize that they weren't built for children. They were built for the masters of the world we've been trained to forget. History isn't what happened. It's just the story they decided to keep. And it's time we started looking through the doors they tried to close forever.